So far in these videos, we've been looking at the Conservative governments of 1951 to 1964. We've covered their domestic policies, their economic policies, and we've also looked at the issue of social change in this period. This video today is the first of two about foreign relations in this same period, 1951 to 1964. There'll be a subsequent video coming up which focuses in more depth on both the Suez Crisis and also decolonisation, Britain's withdrawal from empire. But this video focuses very much on two key issues in the period. The first, Britain's relationship with Europe, and particularly with the EEC, now the EU, and secondly, the role that Britain played in the developing Cold War situation between the USA and the Soviet Union. First of all, it's really important to understand precisely the position and the status of Britain after World War II. When we look back at 1945, we tend to think of Britain being victorious, the defeat of Nazi Germany. We might think about the defeat of Japan as well after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's undoubtedly true that Britain, to some extent, won the war. Now, that's quite a simplistic view because, of course, the USA and the Soviet Union played a key role in that. And that simplistic view can lead us to assume that everything was perfect in terms of Britain's role in the world in 1945. The reality is actually quite different. Britain emerges from World War II no longer the great power that it had been. And of course, it had been a while anyway since Britain's absolute imperial heyday back in the Victorian times, back in the 19th century. British power was already on the wane. But after World War II, Britain is significantly less powerful than it had been. It has huge debts, the economy is really struggling, and we're now into the Cold War era. The superpower is not Britain. The superpower, of course, is not Nazi Germany or Japan either. The two superpowers are the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain clearly is struggling, and that's no more obvious than in 1947. Britain says to America, we can no longer do what we used to do in terms of supporting the government in Greece, in terms of our role in Palestine, and also in terms of our role in Turkey as well. The British had played a significant role in all of those countries, but the economy could no longer fund that, particularly at a time where vast amounts of money were being spent on the welfare state and particularly the NHS. So we've got to be clear from the very beginning when we look at foreign policy in the 50s and the 60s that Britain is no longer this superpower. It emerges, despite being victorious, in a very different position to where it was before World War II. But at the same time, what we also need to be very clear about is that most British politicians, and possibly even more of the British public, just didn't accept this. We've got Britain diminished in its power, but most British people still believing that Britannia rules the waves, that Britain is this great imperial power. That's simply not the case. But what that means is some very difficult decisions have to be made, and quite often the British public and British politicians are not fully prepared to confront this new reality. And in this video, we'll think in particular about some of those decisions about Britain's role in Europe and precisely what sort of relationship Britain should have with the USA as well. So first of all, Europe. What you need to be aware of is something called the Schumann Plan. That's from 1950. And this lays out a plan for what was called a coal and steel community. This was the very beginnings of what would later become the EEC and what we now know as the EU. But at the beginning, it was a fairly small-scale project. It was very much about the fact that France and Germany had fought each other in 1870, in 1914, in 1939. It was very much about trying to keep the peace between France and Germany, trying to stop another European war breaking out. And the plan was, if we integrate, if we make closer links between French and German heavy industry, it will not only reduce the likelihood of a Franco-German war, but it will also help to restore and reconstruct the economies of those countries, both of which were heavily damaged by World War II. And as the 1950s went on, the coal and steel community morphed into the European Economic Community, the EEC. We now call it the European Union. The Treaty of Rome set that out, and France and Germany were the leading members of that, but there were 6 countries altogether. The others, as you can see, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Luxembourg. And Britain, hugely supportive both of the coal and steel community and of the EEC. They felt that a strong Franco-German relationship was good for Europe, that Europe being on a more secure footing was really crucial, especially as the Cold War developed. The enemy was no longer Germany. The enemy for Britain was the USSR, the Communist Soviet Union, and so a strong Europe with Franco-German cooperation at the centre was good news as far as Britain was concerned. That didn't, however, mean that Britain felt its own place was in Europe, and in fact, there were very, very few British people or British politicians who wanted to join the coal and steel community at the very beginning, and we'll have a look at why that was. So, Britain very much supports the coal and steel community, but doesn't believe that it's right for Britain itself to be part of it. And why was that? So this was a common feeling among most politicians of the left and the right wing, most journalists, probably most of the British public as well. On the left wing, when we're looking at Labour politicians, quite a lot of Labour politicians were very suspicious of the community for economic reasons. They believed it was a capitalist club. If you followed the Brexit referendum, you might know that Jeremy Corbyn, as a very left-wing Labour politician, was very reluctant to remain in the EU, and this was a view that he took all those years later, seeing the community as a capitalist club built on free market, almost neoliberal principles, very much about the interests of big business and the rich, rather than the interests of the workers. So for a lot of Labour politicians, the community was actually built on values that they felt didn't fit with socialism, and they felt if Britain became part of the community, it would be harder to build a socialist Britain. On the right wing, we've got Conservative politicians. Their view was a bit different. What they were very keen to protect was what was known as the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth was this new loose grouping of countries that had been part of the British Empire, countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand. For a lot of Conservatives, the key thing that had to be protected was British trade links with those communities and those countries. And the feeling was, in the Conservative Party, if we join the EEC, if Europe becomes our major trading partner, those Commonwealth links will be damaged. There's a third view as well, which was held particularly by many Conservatives, and that was that, particularly as the Cold War developed, and we'll look a bit more at the Cold War in a minute, it was really important for Britain to maintain what was known as the special relationship with the US, the idea that of all America's allies, Britain was the closest. And again, there was something of a feeling that if Britain joined the coal and steel community, or later the EEC, that those ties with the US would be damaged too. So all of these were pretty commonly held views in the 1950s. There's a further view as well that's quite an interesting one. It's the idea that, the EEC is good for those Europeans, those people over there on the continent. Germany's been defeated, France has been liberated from Nazi occupation thanks to us, and they need this sort of thing. They need a community to reconstruct them, to help them become allies again. We don't need that sort of thing. We've won the war. We're still a great power. It's good for the Europeans, but we don't need to join. And that was based, of course, on some of these assumptions we talked about a minute ago. The idea that Britain is still this great power. However, as we'll see, some of these views quite quickly begin to shift. Let's have a look at why. So, we're into 1959 now, we're into the Macmillan years, and Britain decides to form a separate organisation to the EEC. It's called EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, and this is Britain and 6 other non-EEC countries, including quite a few of the Scandinavian countries and Austria. Now, EFTA is fairly successful. EFTA countries see a certain amount of economic growth, but they look at the EEC and it's quite quickly clear that the European community countries are enjoying greater and better economic growth than the EFTA countries. And so Macmillan begins to shift, and by 1961, wanting greater economic growth for Britain, Macmillan and his government apply to join the EEC. Macmillan also reckons that because it will increase the export market for British goods, that will help Britain to improve its industrial production, which had been lagging, as we know, in the 50s. Macmillan also reckoned that because it would expose Britain to greater competition, it would force British industry to become more efficient. There were other factors too encouraging Macmillan. President Kennedy, JFK, who becomes US president in 1961, says to Macmillan, you are, as Britain, a really important link between us in the US and Western Europe. Now, in 1961, there's massive tension over Berlin. The Berlin Wall, dividing East and West Berlin, is built in the summer of that year, and Kennedy recognises that if Britain can play a crucial role at the heart of Europe, it can only be good news for the US as well. So Kennedy very much weighs in on the side of Britain joining the EEC. And there's also finally a bit of a shift in attitudes. Finally, some British people and politicians are questioning this idea of whether Britain really is a world power. The Suez Crisis that we've discussed before has really shaken Britain's confidence. The fact that once the US uncover the British and French plot, they really force the British to withdraw. It's clear that the British are dependent on American power. In Africa, in particular, we've got a process of decolonisation going on, where an increasing number of countries are becoming independent from the British Empire. All of that is finally forcing some British politicians to confront the reality that Britain is no longer this great power, and therefore perhaps its future lies as being a key member of the EEC. And that's why the British bite the bullet and apply to join in 1961. But it's a very, very tricky process. The biggest obstacle in the way of the British is Charles de Gaulle, the French president, a really formidable figure, had been a leading member of the French resistance during World War II, a very, very dominant figure in France in the 50s and 60s. And de Gaulle is hugely suspicious, not just of Britain, but of the US as well. And de Gaulle's view is, if we allow Britain to join the EEC, then not only will Britain dominate it, but so, by default, will America as well. Nevertheless, Britain continues to negotiate, but they're difficult negotiations. The British are absolutely clear that we want to keep our trade links with the Commonwealth even as we join the EEC. And so you've got a lot of very significant EEC policies, which are there to protect EEC members, things like the Common Agricultural Policy, which is very much linked to protecting farmers, particularly in France. But the British say, look, we need to keep our Commonwealth trade going, and we need to make sure, for example, that New Zealand can continue to export its lamb to us. So Britain is looking for loopholes and exemptions out of parts of this Common Agricultural Policy. All of that makes things tricky. But we've got Edward Heath. Now, we'll meet Heath again later. He becomes Prime Minister in 1970. At this point, Heath is working for Macmillan as his chief negotiator. Heath is a clever man. Heath's a very skilled negotiator, and it looks like he's done it. At the beginning of 1963, it looks like Britain is going to be successful. However, at the 11th hour, at the final moment, in walks de Gaulle, and he says, non. Okay, he says, no, I veto it. I do not allow Britain to join the EEC. And this is a huge shock, not only for Britain, but for the other 5 members of the EEC. It looked like this was a done deal, but de Gaulle will not budge. And therefore, Britain remains outside the EEC. That clearly is going to have an economic impact. Britain can't benefit from that economic growth that we talked about. And for the next 10 years, till 1973, Britain remains struggling and outside of the EEC. Not surprisingly, this also has a pretty negative impact on British relations with France as well. The other really significant issue that we're going to discuss now is the British relationship with the US, particularly at the early years of the Cold War. If you're not sure what the Cold War is, just a very brief definition. During World War II, Britain and the US and the USSR, now the USSR, also called the Soviet Union, is Russia plus 14 other states. There were 15 states altogether: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and 9 others, which had formed the USSR. And the USSR was a communist country. It was a country in which all business and industry was owned by the state. The idea was that the state would run that in the interests of the workers, and there would be complete equality. But of course, in order for that to work, then the only way to do it was through a dictatorship. And so the Soviet Union was a dictatorship, not just a dictatorship, but a totalitarian dictatorship led by Joseph Stalin, one of the most murderous dictators in history. So the Soviet Union, a communist dictatorship. On the other hand, we've got the USA. And after 1945, these are the two superpowers: the communist dictatorship of the Soviet Union and the capitalist democracy of the US. The US absolutely founded on the idea that anybody should have the right to own their own business, to become rich. And of course, the US also founded on ideals of liberty and democracy. Now, if you were an African American in the 1950s and 1960s, the idea that the US was a perfect democracy was laughable. But nevertheless, the US certainly claimed to stand for the best ideals of democracy. And therefore, you've got these two superpowers at the end of World War II with diametrically opposed systems: communist USSR, capitalist USA, and we're also in the era of nuclear technology as well. What a dangerous combination. The two superpowers with entirely different political and economic systems, both with the ability to develop the most deadly weapons known to humanity. And therefore, the Cold War is this period of massively growing tension between the US and the USSR after 1945. A period where we never see a full-scale hot war between those two nations, but we do see vastly increasing tension and the growth of nuclear weapons on both sides. So that's the Cold War. Britain's role, and Britain very much sees itself as a key ally of the US. We've talked already about that so-called special relationship, and there's lots of evidence here of what that looked like in practice. In 1949, NATO was created. NATO was a defensive alliance of the US, Canada, and various Western European countries. The idea was that the members would protect any member which came under threat from communism. And from the beginning, Britain was a leading member of NATO. From 1945 onwards, British troops remained in West Germany. Germany was divided during the Cold War. The West was the capitalist democratic part of Germany, and Britain kept their troops stationed in West Germany to help to protect West German democracy. In 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin. You don't need to know lots about the geography here, but just briefly, West Berlin was in the communist part of Germany, but West Berlin was actually democratic and capitalist. So Stalin blockaded it. He cut off road, rail, canal links to it, trying to starve the people of West Berlin and to force that part of his country to become communist as well. The key thing for us is not so much the finer details of the blockade, but the fact that the US and Britain organised a huge airlift where supplies were dropped in to West Berlin to keep the people alive and fed, and Stalin couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't shoot down the planes because the US had nuclear weapons and he didn't quite at that point. The key thing for us is that Britain was very much involved in that. Britain was also very involved in the Korean War between 1950 and 53. Communist North Korea had invaded capitalist democratic South Korea, and around 90,000 British soldiers were sent to support the South Korean side. It was a UN intervention on the side of South Korea, but dominated by the US. But nevertheless, 90,000 British soldiers were involved in that, and over 1,000 died. Macmillan got on well with both President Eisenhower, President 53-61, and his successor Kennedy as well. And Macmillan worked very closely with Kennedy and Eisenhower in the planning of the Paris summit, a meeting between the USA and the USSR in 1960. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where the Americans and the Soviets came extremely close to nuclear war over the island of Cuba. Cuba was a communist country where nuclear weapons were about to become operational, which would have destroyed significant amounts of American territory. It was the closest we'd ever come to nuclear war. Now, eventually the crisis was solved, but it was a time of massive tension. During that crisis, Kennedy, even at the moments of highest tension, kept Macmillan very closely informed. Nevertheless, this wasn't a perfect relationship. We've already talked about the fact that America had forced Britain to withdraw from Suez. The US really quite horrified by Britain's behaviour in the Suez crisis. One other thing that shocked the US was the presence of spies, British spies who were working for the other side. Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean were two British spies in the 40s, very senior intelligence officers, in fact, and they leaked really very confidential information to the Soviets and then actually defected. They went and moved over to the Soviet Union in 1951. And the US looked at this and they said, we can't trust the British intelligence services. We can't share our nuclear secrets with Britain anymore. Clear that there are holes in the British intelligence system, and these spy scandals really did worry the USA. They became very reluctant to share their secrets with Britain anymore. And also, an important part of this issue too is the fact that the US was very much the dominant power. This may have been a special relationship, but it was one where Britain were very much subservient to the US. Britain couldn't afford to be anything different, really. During the missile crisis, we've said that Macmillan was kept informed by Kennedy, but that was it. Britain really wasn't very involved in that. Peter Thornycroft, you might remember, had been Macmillan's chancellor, and he said we were simply bystanders watching this going on. And we've mentioned as well that Britain do contribute to the Korean War, but it's nothing like on the scale that the US had done. And the final issue here, very much linked to the Cold War too, is the issue of the nuclear deterrent, nuclear weapons. Way back in the 40s, Attlee has said, look, Britain will develop nuclear weapons. Clearly, the Americans have their atomic bombs in 1945. The Soviets get theirs in 1949. But obviously, because the US increasingly doesn't share its secrets with Britain, Britain is going to have to get on with this alone. Nevertheless, Churchill, Eden, Macmillan all commit to this. The idea of an independent nuclear deterrent, an independent nuclear weapon which will stop the Soviets from attacking Britain. That's the theory. Great quote from Bevan, who was Attlee's foreign secretary. We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it. And you can see there that by 52, Britain's tested the atomic bomb. By 57, it's got a hydrogen bomb about 1,000 times as deadly and powerful as the atomic bomb. And Britain actually is the third country after the two superpowers to get its own nuclear weapons. If you watched the first video in this series, you'll be aware of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and this quickly becomes the biggest and most powerful pressure group in Britain. This is a group of academics, generally very middle-class people, and supported really by the left of the Labour Party too, and its focus is on unilateral nuclear disarmament. What that means is, CND says, look, we must get rid of our nuclear weapons whatever the Soviets do. Unilateral means we just need to do it, whatever the Soviets do. The view of many others is that nuclear disarmament will be a nice idea in theory, theory, but we have to wait for the Soviets to move at the same time. We can't leave ourselves vulnerable in that way. Nevertheless, CND is a powerful voice. Their marches in 58 and 59 at Aldermaston, where there's a weapons research base, get really significant support, as you can see. Now, by the end of the decade, by 58, the US has changed its mind and actually does begin to share its nuclear secrets with Britain again. That's a result of something called the Mutual Defence Agreement between the two countries. And at that point, Britain moves away from this idea of having an independent nuclear deterrent. Britain had been working on rocket technology, which involves having the ability to fire missiles across the world, but Britain abandons that project, and instead it becomes reliant on America's latest technology, which is the Polaris missile, ballistic missiles launched from submarines. And that leads to a bit of a shift in the Labour Party. From that point onwards, it's not just the real left of the party, but some of the more moderate voices in the party who begin to say, look, we supported a British nuclear deterrent when it was independent from the US, but we're not so keen now on the idea of having British nuclear weapons if we are simply going to be dependent on the US. So there is a little bit of a shift away, and the Labour Party increasingly adopting an anti-nuclear weapon stance.
Huge thank you to Tom for that really interesting video on foreign policy. Particularly interesting to see a period of time where the UK decides that A, doesn't want to, and then does want to join the precursor to the EU. So some really interesting parallels with stuff going on in the modern world. Now, this is part of our playlist looking at modern Britain 1951 to 2007, which is an A-level unit, and this is particularly aimed at supporting students who are studying that unit. There are playlists on other aspects of history, notably armed Tsarist and Communist Russia, and also on the Tudors, which you might find helpful. We've also got a whole range of videos on A-level politics. All of these have been added to all the time as we develop and aim to cover those entire specifications. Make sure you've hit that subscribe so you get notifications as more is added, and you can keep on track with all of that, and hopefully we can give you loads of stuff to support you with your studies. Again, a huge thank you for Tom. Really helpful and interesting video.